What's up, guys? Ben here, bringing you another video today, and apologies if I sound a little bit stuffed up. I'm getting over a post-event sickness, so apologies there. We're chatting Boston Breach today. We're going to go ahead and review their season, see how well they did in their first year in the CDL. Now the season is over. We're getting ready for the off-season, getting ready for roster moves, what the team should do going forward to go ahead and improve and take that next step into being a contender. Let's dive in. So I think overall for Boston, as we sort of dive into each individual event here, I think it was a pretty quality, solid season for them, considering this franchise didn't exist before the season started. Originally, this was the Chicago Huntsman spot, Optic Chicago, for the second year of the league. Once Optic and Team MB merged together to form one org, that Huntsman spot, Optic Chicago spot, or whatever you want to call it, was then up for sale. There were rumors during the offseason that the Washington Justice parent company was going to go ahead and purchase that spot, and it was going to be Methods, TJ, Paul X Venom, but then that move seemed to have fallen through. And then later we heard that Oxygen Esports, which had formed in early 2020 with the Reciprocity org merging with the Kraft family, and obviously Helix Esports as well, the land centers, they were interested in purchasing this spot as a sort of a tandem with the Boston Uprising spot they have in the Overwatch League. And that move happened, and this is how you got the squad. They start off the season with Methods, TJ, Nero, and Capsule. And they had a decent start to the Major 1 cycle. They went 2-3, but they did take that last spot going into the winner's bracket at Major 1. They lost to Atlanta FaZe, New York, and Optic, but they did beat Paris and LAG to go ahead and lock in that spot. Going into Major 1 at ESA, Boston actually didn't play too bad. They got 3-0 by FaZe on the beginning day, but it's FaZe. They did get a nice victory over the Florida Mutineers in losers round 1. They beat Paris in losers round 2. At that point, they were sitting pretty atop 6. And they did lose to eventual 4th place team Toronto in a Game 5 heater. But overall for Boston, was first event with the team, first regular season event with the team. You're going ahead and you're placing top 6 is pretty good, to be honest, for a result for this team and something to build on. So we get to the Major 2 qualifiers, and this team actually plays even better in Major 2, keeps progressing as a squad. They go 4-1 with their only loss to the London Royal Ravens, who also went 4-1 during the split. Surprising definitely result for Boston. They were pretty much in cruise control, right? No one to really challenge them on Berlin hardpoint. They were looking solid in S&D. And you're like, okay, maybe this team could take the next step going into the Minnesota event. Maybe they get a top 4, top 3 placing. And they actually do end up falling through on that. They beat LAG in the winners round 1 portion of the tournament. Obviously, LAG ended up making kind of the losers run, and we'll get to that in a second. They do beat Florida in Game 5 heater in winners round 2. So you're like, okay, Boston's made to a winners finals. That's kind of wild. They do end up facing up against FaZe again, and FaZe take care of business against them, a common theme throughout the season. And then unfortunately for Boston, they do get double rounded. They lose against that hot LAG team in a Game 5 S&D. The team that does eventually go on to win the tournament. So again, for Boston, top 6, top 3 land, that's amazing. You got a lot of points now to qualify for a championship. You're feeling pretty good about the progression of this team. So Boston, obviously we get a couple of weeks off. Boston pulls up to the Pro-Am Classic in Columbus, in Group D with Paris, Ultra Academy, NA, and LAG. Probably on paper, maybe not the strongest teams, but probably one of the more even groups because we know how good Ultra Academy NA was in Challengers all season. And Boston ended up getting top of that group with victories over LAG and Paris, and they actually did surprisingly lose to Ultra Academy NA in a Game 5. Unfortunately for Boston, they lose to eventual runners-up LA Thieves in the first round of the bracket in a 3-1 fashion. This ended up being kind of a recurring theme for Boston. We'll talk about it a little bit more at the end of the video. They really struggled to beat some of the top 3 teams. They were really good against the mid-pack and the lower-pack teams, but once they played a better team than them, they really struggled to pull off that upset. But as we get to the Major 3 qualifiers, it started to be sort of the beginning of the end for this version of this roster. They went 1-4 during the Stage 3 qualifiers, really struggling, 0-3. They had another 3-0 loss against FaZe. They lost in Game 5 to Florida. They did beat Toronto, but they lost to Thieves in New York. And a team that was looking strong prior to the break was suddenly looking a little bit wobbly and maybe not up there with some of the contenders. And it showed when they pulled up to Toronto. They played one series and they were out of there, getting 3-0'd by Minnesota. Rock bottom for this team that had looked solid so far in the beginning of the season. So going into Major 4, Boston actually makes a pretty interesting change. They managed to acquire Reese Vivid from the Florida Mutineers, and they send Capsule to the bench, 2 challengers. So they roll a lineup of Methods, TJ, Nero, and Vivid with hopes of trying to qualify for a chance because they were sitting pretty close to the cut line at this point. And they actually do pretty good in these qualifiers. They end up going 4-1 once again. Their only loss during this qualifier stage was to Thieves, but they beat a bunch of good teams. They beat Seattle, Toronto, Optic Texas, LAG. So it looked like that roster change bringing Reese in, who is a very fast player, but someone to fall behind Nero, ended up working out pretty good for them. And they were looking in a strong spot to qualify for champs going into the event in New York. And at the major in New York, they have a tough Game 5 loss to Florida to start things off, but they are able to eliminate Seattle and loses round 1. And then they run up against Optic Texas. Again, common recurring theme with Boston. They're a solid team, but the minute they play a team that's in sort of the tier of skill above them, they really struggle. They lose to Optic Texas 3-1. All good for Boston, though. They qualify for champs, and that's something to focus on after this event. We were talking about this, I think, before this event. Look, like, my expectation for Boston going into this event was very much in the happy to be here category. You looked at sort of the 8 teams that we have here, and I had them in London as sort of like the 2 teams. It's like I don't really expect them to win a lot of series or any series at all at this tournament. Top 8 would be a fair placing based on how they've done so far this season, and that's where Boston ended up. They ended up losing to eventual tournament winners and CDL champs LA Thieves in a Game 5. I don't know how that series went to 5, but Boston really played well, and unfortunately they couldn't carry that momentum versus Toronto, who dispatched them in 4 maps. And for Boston, what was a promising season, I think didn't end all too poorly. You probably wanted better than top 8 at champs, but I think if you asked them at the beginning of the season, would you take qualifying for champs in top 8 instead of being sort of at the bottom of the league, you probably take that deal, to be honest. So let's dive in a little bit more about this Boston team and how they played this season. Like a lot of teams that we have taken a look at so far this year, and sort of how you look at sort of the overall kind of lay of the land, a lot of teams that end up kind of playing 500 ball or sub 500 ball going into champs, and Boston was no exception. They're going 16 and 18 in series count. I think definitely the weakest game mode for them ended up being control, surprisingly. I would wonder if that's a little bit of discipline, and we'll talk about sort of the discipline thing here in a sec. Okay, S&D team, they had their strong maps, they had their weak maps, and they were pretty even across the board. Hardpoint team. And as I alluded to, if we look at the top 3 teams kind of at the end of the season, you can kind of see where sort of Boston couldn't get over the hump on. They were 0-3 against Thieves so far, 1-2 against Optic, but I believe that the one win was when Prolu was playing with them in the beginning of Major 4, so that was not with Illy, and 0-4 against FaZe with only 1 map win in the 4 series. So for Boston, I think it was a case of like you could beat a lot of the mid-pack teams, but when you played the big dogs, the people that you really want to beat to make a name for yourselves, they were unable to do so this season. Taking a look at the overall stats, and shout out Easy Mac for this one, it tells a little bit of an interesting story. One thing to keep in mind is these are overall stats from throughout the season, so you see Reese with a 0.9 that includes his time on Florida. And look, like, this is a great example of KD not telling the whole story about a team, because Capsule averaged a 1. He didn't end up making and finishing the season with Boston, and from my understanding, he was dropped because he was playing a little bit too slow, not making the right plays on the map. So even though he was able to get kills and was averaging around a 1, it wasn't really what the team was looking for. Whereas you have players like Reese Vivid and Nero, who I think really helped kind of get this team over the line at the end, but Reese didn't have a particularly good season, averaging a 0.9, and Nero was around that like a 0.94, 0.95 mark. I think the only person on here KD-wise that I think probably if he had played a little bit better would have helped his team is probably TJ Halley. He's sort of in that flex position, and this is the one criticism we've had, or I've had about TJ for a couple of years now. You know top end that he can be a really good impact player, but you don't see it too consistently, and when he plays good teams, he really struggles to get consistent results. And look, I think if this team had wanted to be a top 4, top 3 team at the end of the season, they would have needed Teach to kind of get a couple of more kills each map. And look, we got to talk about the Zen 1.08. It was another good year for ARs, but the criticism for Zen from the community for a number of years has been that he's not a guy that's going to go and really sacrifice his KD to make difficult challenges. I think there were times during the final portions of the season when you would watch the minimap, Zen's picking up the pinch a lot and is really kind of out of the play, and I'd like to see him get more in the mix. It would obviously come to sacrifices his KD because he's going to get weird timings, but I think it would have improved their team play overall. All right, let's talk contracts and what they should do in the offseason. So here's the lay of the land for Boston. I've still been unable to really understand Reese Vivid sort of team situation. So if anyone really knows if he's a free agent or if he's got a team option, please slide to my DMs and let me know, because I've been trying to find out for weeks. But I'm going to assume for the sake of this that re-signed a new deal and he's sort of a team option. So Boston's kind of can go in a lot of different directions here. We discussed it on an episode of The Flank at the end of the season, but I really think kind of Boston's kind of goal here is probably to upgrade at sort of the main AR, flex AR position, because you're not really going to be able to upgrade too much at the SMG position. I mean, they can take a crack at players like Afro or Hydra, and if they're able to pull that off, then yeah, you make that move. I don't think Shotzi's really going to go to Boston, candidly. But you look at the rest of the players that are listed there under free agent SMGs, and I don't really see anyone that would really upgrade them again, other than Afro and Hydra, if they're able to pull that off. Where they can upgrade is definitely at the AR position, and there's actually a lot of particularly interesting and good options out there for Boston to build around. I think Attach is a very interesting one to me. I know I've talked a lot in the past about Dylan probably being a better fit for moving back to LA, where he's from, but I could see a world in which they kind of give Dylan the keys, and they can be an interesting player for him to build around. They play a lot quicker with Dylan as the main, team. You obviously got Klay kind of in the mix here. I won't be surprised if Boston's already reached out or talked to Klay about sort of being a key cornerstone. You got to keep in mind for Boston here, if your goal is to get rid of Zen, right, and upgrade at that level, you're going to need to offset that with some brand power so you can continue to build your franchise, continue to bring in sponsors, and Klay would definitely do that for you. Preston's an interesting one. Like if I'm between TJ Halley and Preston, I'm probably taking Priesta. I think both are not amazingly consistent players, at least sort of at this point in their careers, the way they played the last couple of years. But I think from a ceiling standpoint, Preston's is probably a little bit higher. And you've got the Awakening Skies duo, and this is an interesting one. Like one I can see kind of Boston being in the mix. If these two are leaving Florida and not re-signing, and again, I don't know if they're going to stay together or split up, but they both could fill kind of upgrade positions on this roster. And there were other routes Boston could go down, right? Like the Toronto situation we talked about in the last video. I don't know if all 6 of these players are going to be around. It's Toronto going to pick up the options on all 6, but there are some upgrade paths here if they want to negotiate with Toronto. I also think the Paris players, considering likely they will be free agents, there's some interesting opportunities here. You know, Gravity, Donnie, you obviously got John and Jimbo. There's some conversations you can be had if you want to maybe supplement your roster with a few of these guys. And the last player I think that's probably definitely obtainable if he sort of becomes free is Havoc. I think considering that Boston probably wants to become a better S&D team, at least more consistent S&D, Havoc would get you there. And it becomes a big question then if Minnesota don't renew his option, I would say if you're Boston, you probably don't even think about it and you start talking to Havoc. I think my kind of final thoughts for this team is what I think limited their ceiling this year was having a lot of young players in the team who really just kind of didn't really play a structured version of Call of Duty. You'd watch a mini-map, and I think Tej and Zen were forced into a lot of situations. We just had to kind of let the younger players go rogue, and that works great against mid-pack teams. But I think where they struggled against your Optic, your FaZe, your like Thieves, they weren't as disciplined as those teams, and they were really exploitable when teams were able to read when Nero and when Reese Vivid were kind of out of the play, and they could solo out Tejan's in. So I think the important thing for me is trying to upgrade the squad, right? You probably want to place higher than top 6, top 8 next season. And to do that, I think they're going to have to upgrade at least in 2 spots on the squad, if not more. So they're going to probably be linked to a lot of players over the next couple of weeks. So be on the lookout for them. And guys, let me know what you think of this video. Do you see Boston as a big offseason player? What moves would you like them to make? Where do you think Boston will rank at the end of the season if they're able to make the moves they're able to make? Let me know in the comments what you think. If you liked the video, obviously smash the like button. I would always appreciate you subscribing to the channel. We're putting out a lot of content. We're doing more of these off-season previews over the coming days, and then we're going to be rolling out some more content starting next week, so be on the lookout for that. And as always, guys, I'll see you in the next one.